So today is May 22nd, 2023. Two readings for today. John 11:47 through 54. Acts 17:1 through 9. At that time the chief priests and Pharisees gathered at the council and said, "What are we to do? For this man performs many signs. If we let him go on thus, everyone will believe in him, and the Romans will come and destroy both our place and our nation." But one of them, Caiaphas, who was high priest that year, said to them, "You know nothing at all. You do not understand that it is expedient for you that one man should die for the people, and that the whole nation should not perish." He did not say this of his own accord, but being high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus should die for the nation. Not for the nation only, but to gather into one the children of God who scattered abroad. So from that day on they took counsel to put him to death. Jesus therefore no longer went about openly among the Jews, but went from there to the country, the wilderness, to a town called Ephraim, and there he stayed with the disciples. Okay. In those days, when the apostles had passed through Amphipolis and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica, where there was a synagogue of the Jews. And Paul went in, as was his custom, and for 3 weeks he argued with them from the Scriptures, explaining and proving that it was necessary for the Christ to suffer and to rise from the dead, and saying, "This Jesus whom I proclaim to you is the Christ." And some of them were persuaded, and joined Paul and Silas, as did a great many of the devout Greeks, and not a few of the leading women. But the Jews were jealous, and taking some wicked fellows of rabble, they gathered a crowd, set the city in an uproar, and attacked the house of Jason, seeking to bring them out to the people. And when they could not find them, they dragged Jason and some of the brethren before the city authorities, crying, "These men who have turned the world upside down have come here also, and Jason has received them, and they are all acting against the decrees of Caesar, saying that there is another king, Jesus." And the people and the city authorities were disturbed when they heard this, and when they had taken security from Jason and the rest, they let them go. All right, so I think what we're going to do today is try to do a psychological reading of both of these texts. So according to the methodology of psychological interpretation, each of the individuals listed in the account are aspects of the psyche, and the dynamics represent some aspect of the psychological dynamics. All right, so let's just go through these one by one. The Pharisees gathered at the council and said, "What do we do? The man performed many signs. If we let him go on thus, everyone will believe him, and the Romans will come and destroy us." All right, so the Pharisees are afraid that the conquerors will kill them. So the Pharisees can represent the ego. The Romans can represent outer objects relative to the psyche, or even inner objects of the psyche, our own persecutory tendencies. So the ego, persecution, and then Jesus represents the ontological ground of being, or the being of the human being. And so the ego is afraid that there will be persecution. So this is interesting if you think of it totally psychologically, because you might say that the ego is afraid of following the inner being because of repercussions in the external world. But if you read this entirely psychologically, then what this is saying is the ego is afraid of aspects of the psyche. It's the individual's own psyche which will persecute it for following the being, the ground of the being of the human being, which has often been called the self, and which I will typically not refer to it as. But one of them, Caiaphas, who was a high priest, so an aspect of the ego. The ego. So now here's the ego talking. If we just set up this, just assume, for sake of argument, that we've set this up properly. an element of the ego, a Pharisee, namely Cephas, said to other aspects of the ego, so it's just consciousness talking to itself, saying, it's good that someone within the individual should be persecuted. So if you persecute an element of yourself, this is the Pharisaical reasoning. If you consciously persecute an aspect of yourself, then your wider being shall not perish. So it's this idea that self-criticism is protective against annihilation. Okay, so essentially this is just take that framework for what it's worth. And so now Jesus is, so the persecution of the individual prevents, so my egoic persecution of myself is intended to preempt persecution from outside. So think of from outside as the unconscious or something. And so the Pharisees are reasoning that, from a psychological standpoint, if the individual identifies that element of themselves that they can persecute, namely the being of their being, if the ego persecutes the ego, the being of the psyche's being, then it's protected against a wider persecution. So there's this justification of the repression of the being of the human being, or the self. Okay, let's go to Acts. Paul went in to a synagogue in Greece, it seems, and he said this. He says, "It's necessary for the Christ to suffer and to rise from the dead. This Jesus whom I proclaim to you is the Christ." And some of them were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas, as did a great many of Greeks. Attacked the house of Jason, seeking to bring them out to the people. And when they could not find them, they dragged Jason and some of the brethren before the city authorities, crying, "These men have turned the world upside down. Who have turned the world upside down have come here also." Jason has received them, and they are all acting against the decrees of Caesar. All right, so this is very, very, very interesting, saying that there is another king. All right, so let's make some assignments of the people to the psyche. So Paul is a defender. Paul might represent me reading the Gospel of John just a few moments ago. That is, he is defending that he's trying to give some understanding. So Paul represents kind of the aspect of the psyche that is the understanding. He's trying to find understanding from this dynamic. And so what he's saying is, if we remember our psychological assignments, the Christ is the being of the human being. The Pharisees are essentially the ego or the conscious aspects of persecution. And the Romans are kind of the unconscious aspects of persecution. So this story is the mind seeking an understanding of why it persecutes itself. And what Paul is saying, essentially what this aspect of the psyche is telling the psyche, the whole psyche, is that the natural process whereby consciousness persecutes the being of the human being, that is actually the function of the being of the human being. is to endure the torments of the conscious mind. It's that which can survive the torments of the conscious mind. Okay. And I don't know if there's too much more here. What remains to be kind of elucidated, though, is Paul is now the element of the mind which understands that other elements of the mind will persecute the being of the human being. And so Paul is someone who watches this process take place. And so it's almost as if, because it's true that Jesus is wholly other, Jesus is the only person in these stories who represents someone who I am not, namely, the being of my being. Because I am not my being. It always appears to me, the being of my being always appears to me as something other than me. And so Paul is me watching me persecute my own being and saying there is no other way. And so Paul now represents, rather than in the Christian tradition, you often hear imitate Christ, which is psychologically analogous to saying allow the being of your being to motivate and to drive your behavior and your thoughts. This is the being to which we can consult, but it's always other from us. It is me and it's not me. Is the image of God, there's all these, there's mirror analogies that we can use. And we can talk about how I always appear to myself in a mirror image. And so Christ is always other. He's the one in whom we think of, the one who we think of as being other. But Paul is an element of my being, psychologically analogous to the who you hear talking right now. It's the person who is aware that they are aware. Because I know that I'm aware. So Paul is kind of, within the biblical tradition, so important because he represents the human individual, the human person, separate from the being of their being, which is always other. Okay. So let's see if there's any other characters here that we can... the Jews were jealous of Jason. There's this whole thing with the house and all of this. But I think we'll leave it there for today.
So let's return just for a minute to the interpretation of the two texts for today. On the one hand, we were talking about the way the passage from the Gospel of John can be interpreted psychologically. And we assigned three roles. The Pharisees were the ego, the Romans were the unconscious, and Jesus was the being of the human being. And so one thing I want to pick up on and spend some more time with is the idea that the Romans are the unconscious. Because when we say that, what we're suggesting is, to the extent that the Romans are persecutory and that the Pharisees are persecutory, the idea is, in this passage, that the ego is consciously persecuting the being of the human being for the purpose of sacrificing that being for that being's preservation. So the ego here, the Pharisees and the ego, are giving up the being of the human being to the unconscious, to the Romans, to the natural forces that the being of the human being is a part of. And so the Pharisees are separating themselves off from the Roman persecution of the being of the human being. And so what's implicit in this framework is that the Romans represent that unconscious persecution. And what's suggested is that the being of the human being is thereby always persecuted. And so the Pharisees are kind of the second order, the egoic order over the more natural order, the more primitive order of the conflict between the being of the human being and the unconscious into which it's born, which is a natural persecution of that being. Though it's the very being into which the being of the human being is embedded. So the being of the human being is embedded in the human being, and that being is always persecuted by the unconscious, or kind of the being into which the being of the human being is embedded. So that persecution is an unconscious natural persecution, to which the Pharisees are willing to submit, to which the ego is willing to submit, the being of the human being, which is the Christ. So I think the idea here is, and I have the image here from Boma. The idea is, to the extent that the Pharisees represent the ego, what the ego is trying to do, from the Pharisaical, from the point of view of the Pharisees, is placate the unconscious, so that the unconscious essentially doesn't come after it. It's saying, essentially the ego is saying, it will give something up to the natural forces for the purposes of its own preservation. So it gives up the very being on which it is dependent in order to avoid the persecution to which the being of the human being is already subject. So ultimately what the Christian tradition is going to say is that rather than the ego standing apart from this struggle between nature and being, Christian tradition is going to say something about the ego putting itself into that struggle, so that the being of the human being can escape the natural struggle, the predicament of struggle, and that state of nature. And so that's kind of represented here by the center. The heart here is essentially the ego, or the conscious human being that intentionally places itself at the center. So on the right is light, on the left is dark. And the idea is creation is light comes into being, or creation comes into being only through its opposite. So light comes into being only in contrast to the dark. And it's always embedded in its opposite as a condition of its coming into being. So in our psychological setup, the being of the human being is embedded in the unconscious. The being of the human being is light, and the unconscious, or the created psyche, is darkness. And the being of the human being comes into being through the dark unconscious. So the ego then, assessing the situation of light coming into dark, coming always into its opposite, always through these countervailing forces. The ego, the Pharisees, the pharisaical symbol of the ego, is willing to essentially take a step back and just watch that struggle and allow that process to unfold. But with Boma and what we'll see with Paul when we talk about Acts, is that rather than allowing that to occur, or enabling that to occur, or intentionally sacrificing the being so that it can preserve itself, right? So the Pharisees allow the Romans to take the Christ in order to preserve themselves. Rather than that, rather than becoming a persecutor of the being in the same manner in which the Romans or the natural unconscious is, the idea is that the ego must do something different. It has to insert itself as a different thing into the struggle between light and dark, between being and nature. And again, that's represented here by placing itself in the center. And the idea is, rather than standing outside of it, or encouraging it, or creating more darkness, the idea is that the ego sits within this conflict as a means of its transcendence. It's the bearing witness to the struggle. that this transcendence can kind of start to take place. Okay, so that's why we see in Acts Paul. So Paul in Acts represents a person, me or you or us having a conversation. And Paul's thinking about the process of the struggle between being and nature, and the persecution of being by its opposite into which it was necessarily born. And so this is psychologically, Paul represents psychologically a new form of ego. And so I think there is kind of a tension here between Christ is the new ego, the sacrificial ego, but Christ is a representation of the natural process of light, and what happens to light when it comes into being. And what happens to light when it comes into being is it's met with its opposite, which is darkness, which is the Romans, and which is the Pharisees when the ego is aligned with nature. So Paul represents a new ego. Essentially, Paul's trying to replace the symbol of the Pharisee as the ego, which just submits light to darkness, which submits being to nature, and which takes the natural process as kind of as it is and encourages it. Paul wants to say something about how egoic beings should orient themselves towards the observation of the struggle of light coming into dark, the struggle of Christ into the Roman world, where the Pharisees want to suppress it. Paul wants to say something else about it. And so John 2 wants to say something about light overcoming darkness. There's a certain element there. So the psychological meaning of this text in Acts is that in order for light to overcome dark, in a world in which there exists this third egoic thing, with nature and with being, what Paul is trying to say is he wants to take a different position, and this different position is that he places himself as a new notion of being at the center of the process of being and nature, the conflict between being and nature. And I think part of what he's saying is, if you have the courage to stand at that intersection, you will see the resurrection of being, the resurrection of Christ. If you stand, when you see light and darkness struggle for the struggle of light with dark in the world, what you'll see is the death of the light. But if you as an ego don't take that at face value, essentially, and you wait, you will see the resurrection of the light. But you can't if you place yourself as the Pharisees do on the outside, and kind of are complicit in the darkness. But it's not about being good. It's not about being good. Paul, I think, because of the way Paul writes, when we think about Paul as a writer, he very much makes claims about good and bad. But I think that has to be understood when we understand this psychologically. We have to understand it differently. I don't think we're going to get into that here. Because I think at this point it becomes extraordinarily difficult to say something more about what this means psychologically, because we notice in Paul, in Acts, Acts was not written by Paul. I don't know why I keep saying Paul. It's talking about Paul. I think it's talking about Paul. Anyway, Luke, whatever it is. Saying, it's hard to say something more psychologically about this, because if it's true that light has to suffer as Christ does in order for us to see its resurrection, then there is, I guess, in the world of psychology at least, there's this notion that one has to become the betrayer. So in order for the Christ to have become the Christ, he had to be betrayed by Judas. And so if we think of the Christ as the being of our being, then who is it that does the betraying? we notice there is, of course, the ontological betrayal of the Romans, which represent the unconscious betrayal, which is the natural betrayal, which is always opposed to being. Nature and being are always opposed. But it wasn't the Romans that betrayed the Christ. It was Judas. And Judas is the ego. And the ego is the betrayer of the Christ, who allows us to understand that it is the Christ. And so within the individual human being, there will always be the betrayal of, I will always betray my being with my ego. And that's necessary for the Christ, for the being of my being to reveal itself to me. And so there is always this discussion in the Gnostics and in certain forms of psychology, early 20th century psychology, that maybe Judas, if Judas is so critical to the Christ becoming the Christ, then what is it that separates us morally from Judas? Because of course we want to say that we don't want to be pharisaical, we don't want to be Judas, we want to be Paul. We want to be the one who stands in for the resurrection, who waits for the resurrection. And yet even Paul only came to see the resurrection through his persecution of the Christians. And so I think when you start to think psychologically, you want to start to think clinically. The question is, to what extent does one encourage betrayal in order to see the resurrection? And I think the response is, of course, that one has already, right, so the idea here is essentially that you must sin in order to repent. And so there is kind of this idea psychologically, if you're thinking about the psychological process, that you would encourage one to sin so that they could reflect on their sin. I think the clear response is everyone has already sinned and has already been a betrayer. And so it's a question of imminence. But I think that, so that's the tension I wanted to draw out here. Is what is the meaning of the Roman in this context? And so I think we've talked about the distinction and kind of the conflict and struggle, the eternal struggle between being and nature. So Christ represents being, and the Romans represent nature, Pharisees represent the ego, and Paul represents a new type of ego.